Hey everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know about this week's sponsor for Tabletop Babble. I'm talking about Cobalt Press. You know Cobalt Press, started by game designer extraordinaire Wolfgang Bauer, who has years of experience. They put out great products like the Tome of Beasts, which gave us over 400 monsters for 5th edition D&D. They put out the Midgard campaign setting. They put out Deep Magic. They put out the Kobold guides to take your pick, plots and campaigns, combat, magic, game mastering. They are amazing, and Kobold Press wants to help you out when your players go totally off the rails. They have a great book by an amazing designer called John Sawatsky called Prepared that gives you tons of encounters ready to go. You can drop them right in. I run them all the time in my games. I don't even read them until I am running them many times because they're made for the unexpected and it works out beautifully. And Kobold has had so much success and so much praise for Prepared that they're now putting out Prepared 2, which will be coming later this month. There are encounters for levels 1 through 11 in here. Each encounter is playable in a single session. It is really incredible, amazing stuff. They're unique. They're fun. They're super entertaining. They're driven by great story. You want to check this out. You can get the first Prepared now. Boom. You can get in PDF, print, whatever you like. Prepared 2 is going to be available October 1st, but you can pre-order it right now on the Kobold store. Themes include everything from a Goblin War Wagon to Icebound Horrors and Dragon Lairs. So go check it out at the Kobold Press store at koboldpress.com today or wherever you get great adventures for role-playing games. Kobold Press, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Tabletop Babble. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, we're talking about improv in tabletop role-playing games. And to do that, I've invited 3 of the best panelists I know to talk about improv. First, we got Noel from Dames and Dragons, an amazing show right here on our very own Don't Split the Podcast network. Then we also got Michael from the RPG Academy. He is incredible, talks about improv all the time, runs an all-improv game. Can't wait for you to hear what he has to say. And finally, an improv expert who reached out to me, who is just incredible. I think we are going to have a blast. His name is Dave Marino. So, let's get right to the action. Okay, everybody, now I am here with 3 fantastic improv folks. We're going to be talking about improv in role-playing games today. Super excited to talk with some of my favorite people. I believe this is all their first time on Tabletop Babble, but we'll start with a person I've talked to many times before for other podcasts. Michael from the RPG Academy, who are you? And what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Well, I am Michael from the RPG Academy. I'm the host of that podcast, as well as the network. And we do a podcast about role-playing games. We talk about them, try to help people get started, help them get a little bit better at it. And we also do actual plays, as well as interview people, particularly about Kickstarter.
Excellent. Yes. That is, I would say, a nice truncation of your resume. You do so many things. It's hard to believe you also have a family and a job.
So some would say too many things.
Some might say, perhaps your wife. Yes, definitely. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here on Tabletop Babble. Also with me, very excited to talk with her today, is Noel from the Dames and Dragons podcast, one of my favorite actual plays right here on the Don't Split the Podcast network. Noel, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
I'm Noel, and like you said, I'm on Dames and Dragons, which is an actual play podcast with a cast of 3 others of my good friends. And we release episodes every other Monday on iTunes and other places. So check us out. You can go to damesanddragons.com.
Excellent. That is pretty awesome. I'm really excited to have you here to talk about improv. It's one of the things that struck me about your podcast. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that a little bit more. And the person who suggested this topic, really excited to have him here today, Dave Marino. Welcome to Tabletop Babble. Who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Well, thank you, James. I have made my name not so much in the D&D podcast ecosystem, but in the improv world. I've been playing D&D since the Red Book, since we started setting up candles and plastic skulls in our unfinished basement, and playing all the way through to now. And since around 1996, I've been doing improv, mostly in Boston at Improv Boston Theater. So I've always incorporated the principles of improv in the RPG world. So I'm psyched to talk about how that applies.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm excited to have you all here because improv, or making it up as we go along, and I'm sure we can get into a broader and deeper definition than that, of course. Improv, I think, has been a part of D&D kind of since the very beginning, and people play with all levels of it. Some dungeon masters do a lot of prep and have very linear games, and some players enjoy that. Some are far more open, do no prep, and sort of let the players drive the story and make stuff up as they go along. And a lot of people fall somewhere in between on that spectrum, right? But I would say, because in general, especially as we get older and we play these games, we let players drive the story. All games eventually go off the rails, and we find ourselves at a point as dungeon masters and as players needing to improv to figure out what to do next. We look down at our character sheets and we find, now I don't have anything on my character sheet that covers this situation, but I can do anything I can do in the real world. So what would I do in this situation, right? We find both of those things on both sides of the Dungeon Master's screen or GM screen, depending on what game you're playing. So what I want to jump into first is, how do you get comfortable with improv at the table? I think when a lot of people start playing, Dungeon Masters in particular, feel the need to write everything out, right? Because they want to have everything covered. They want to be prepared. Your notes or that published adventure is a safety net for you, right? Because you don't want to ruin other people's fun. You're worried. You're like, my friends are counting on me, or strangers at a convention are counting on me. How do I make this work? So, Dave, why don't we start with you, since you've got the improv background, and I'm guessing have been doing this long enough that you've brought many new people into the improv fold. How do we make people comfortable with improv and make them comfortable losing the character sheet and losing the notes and just telling a story?
Yeah, so I can actually address this from two different angles. One is on the improv stage, and the other is at the RPG table. On the improv stage, what we start in 101 is you have to be comfortable feeling uncomfortable. Allow yourself, this kind of sucks, but then look at the consequences, which is essentially zero. There are zero consequences to being uncomfortable, especially in a safe space, like an Improv 101 class or with your friends around the table. So that's one, is just, you know what, this is new, and the only way to learn something new is by doing things different. It's just part of the process. So I say, if you don't feel weird, you're not doing it right. Because you're stuck in your little envelope. And at the table, it's similar to that. It's like, just take a risk and then realize that the risk you take either has a positive consequence, a neutral consequence, or a quote negative consequence, which in any case forwards the story and adds more, inspiration to the story. And there's, as you said, that's a really good point, James, is that there's levels and levels of improv. I'm a very articulate person, and I don't go into a meeting unless I know exactly what's happening, despite my improv background. So I would really lay out all the details. And then a genius named Mike Shea came up with the lazy dungeon master method, which allowed me to put all that details onto a single index card or a sheet of paper. And that sort of gave me permission to fill in the gaps, which is improvising.
Yeah.
So I think it's finding your own level of comfort in whatever you want to do. But I would encourage you to just stretch that a little bit. What would happen if I didn't name this guy on the paper ahead of time? What would happen if I didn't know what the town looked like before they entered town? And just sort of just test out your skills a little bit.
Sure, give yourself a couple of gaps. I love that, and test it, and also that idea of faking it till you make it. Right? If you enter with confidence into the sort of improv comedy realm. Like, I know this from doing improv in college. Entering with confidence and trying not to think of stuff ahead of time really does serve yourself and the people you're playing with. And I think that also works with at the table, right? Not predetermining what you're going to do can help service that in some ways.
Yeah, and I would go even one step beyond that. People say fake it till you make it, but you can use this term in public speaking, for example, where you don't feel comfortable. It's fake it till you become it. All these risks you're taking becomes learned behavior over time, and then it's just part of your arsenal.
Nice. Michael, we were talking about this on your podcast last week. You run heavy improv games. You don't do a ton of prep.
Because I'm lazy.
Yeah, because you're lazy, and you're probably, like me, seasoned enough to know that, like, players aren't going to do half of what I plan for them anyway, so I might as well not waste my time.
Absolutely.
How do you get the confidence and give your players the confidence to sort of be that bold with improv?
Well, there's a couple of things that I would kind of circle back around to what David was saying. That for me, there are different levels of improv, and you can become comfortable with one maybe before you do the other. There's improv just within the scene from a role-playing standpoint, that I don't know what this innkeeper is going to say, so let's just make some stuff up. There's improv from the sense of, I don't know what's going to happen when you encounter the guards. Maybe you'll fight them, maybe you won't. And then there's improv from, I have no idea what this game is even about. We're just going to sit down at the table, and depending on what the players say, I'll roll with it. So I think it's a little bit easier, like David was saying, to have some gaps. Like, okay, I know you're going to go meet the king, and I think one of the king's men or women behind the scene is actually the bad guy, but I don't know who yet. But just based on how the role playing goes, I might work backwards and go, well, I think it makes the most sense that this is the bad guy because of what happened. But for me, the easiest way to get people started is to do somewhat like a consequence-free version. If I've been running a D&D campaign for 4 years, and this is like my magnum opus, I may not want to screw that up, quote unquote, screw that up by trying an improv. So maybe we do a one-shot one night where I'm just going to make it up on the fly. Maybe 2 people don't show up, so we can't have the main campaign, but I don't want to cancel. So you just throw something together. It doesn't matter if they even have character sheets. You're Uthgar the Barbarian, you're Kalasar the Bard. Let's go. And just practice in a consequence-free zone, because no matter how bad you screw that up, it's not really going to affect what you think of as your game and as your story. And then the biggest thing for me is understanding that the players are there to have fun. And as long as you don't get in the way of their fun, they probably will have fun. So it's okay to not be 100% accurate all the time. If you say this person was the bad guy, and the next game you're like, oh yeah, I forgot, and I made this other person the bad guy. No one really cares as long as it's fun. So just focus on that if everybody has a good time, everyone's laughing, and everyone wants to come back next week, then you're doing it right.
Yeah, as long as it's weird, you're doing it right. Right? That's the RPG Academy motto. Modified.
Something like that.
With the words of Dave Marino modifying it. But yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good suggestion, right? If you're worried about screwing up your long-term campaign, jumping in with a one-shot is great. All of this advice about, testing the waters to make yourself comfortable is really, really good. I turn now to Noel. Noel, our audience likely knows you as a player.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you have a lot of game master experience.
Zero.
Great. So this is a good question for you, because when I listen to you on Dames and Dragons or on episodes of DSPN Presents, I am always extremely entertained and impressed with the decisions that you make. They seem out of the box, but still appropriate for the story and still work well. So how do we as players become comfortable losing the character sheet and sort of being more in the moment and just doing what seems best for the story rather than, getting bogged down with what the best, mechanical decision is or that sort of thing?
Right. Well, I mean, for me, that's kind of exactly it. I will say I'm actually not much of an improver, or I kind of am, but I would kind of paradoxically say that the key to improv is preparation. But, and by that, I mean not that you should decide what you're going to do in advance, but that you should know your character and know what your character would do in a variety of different situations in advance. And I think a lot of DMs kind of operate that way too, as far as like they know the villain's motivations and how they would react to certain situations without knowing what that situation is going to be. For me, really thinking a lot about my character, what kind of focuses they have, what things they're obsessed with, that really helps me. Because I think thinking of the best technical thing to do on the fly isn't something that you can really do unless you have a high level mastery of the game you're playing. You're going to have to stop and think and stare at your sheet and be like, what the heck, you know? But thinking of like, what would my character do in this situation? What would their reaction be? And I think on Dames and Dragons, we really do a lot of that, actually, not really doing the best technical thing, but doing what feels right for our characters. And I think sometimes that gets us into trouble, but on the other hand, I think it is more fun. And it gives us all a sense of verisimilitude. I also think that to get comfortable, a really important thing is playing with people you're comfortable with. I guess if you're just diving in like a public setting, you're not playing with friends, that's maybe not helpful. But if you can get, you know, random people who have never played before that you are already comfortable with to play, I think that's really ideal, especially when you're starting out, because sometimes people aren't that forgiving when they want you to do the best technical thing and not just kind of play around and have fun. And then, you know, that builds up. And then every decision you make, you're more unsure of yourself and you're less willing to kind of be off the wall and just have a good time.
So let me ask you this, Noel. If we're comfortable with improv and we're ready to dive in, how do we, as players, game masters, sort of as a group of storytellers, how do we best support each other to do that improv, right? Like, how do we support ideas, get the best ideas kind of out on the table, coming forward, and get everybody involved so that everybody's having fun and it's not just one person coming up with wacky or great story ideas?
I will say most of the people I've played with, I haven't had to like be coaxing them
Which is great.
into doing things.
Yeah. So how do you all support each other then?
I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying, is we let each other make mistakes. And especially if it's in the name of your character is doing something stupid that's going to mess things up for us. But that's exactly what your character would do on Dames and Dragons. That's often Corbin, sometimes
sounds
me.
Right.
And even if it's not in character, letting each other make mistakes and not punishing each other and not punishing the DM if they make an occasional mistake, and having a DM you can trust not to punish you, because when you are doing improv, it's going to happen. And if everybody's getting more and more mad about it, you're not having fun anymore, and all of a sudden you're not doing things right. And I think to some extent that can be in just general improv too, not lingering on the joke that failed or the action that failed, just saying, what are we going to do next? How are we going to make it better from here? Because otherwise you lose self-esteem, and that is not good for improv.
Yes. Yeah. And failure and conflict make a story interesting, right? If you were succeeded at everything all of the time, what's the point? It sounds almost to me like you're saying it's a game and maybe people should chill sometimes.
I wouldn't go that far. That's pretty extreme.
Let me ask you then the same question, Dave. What are some good ways that people support each other in this storytelling once they become comfortable with improv? What's a good way for people to catch each other and raise each other's ideas up and make those important and significant?
Well, one thing I do is I role model as good behavior as best as I can. So if I want my players to come up with something spontaneous, or if I want them to take a risk, then I will do the same thing. So that's one of them, is just sort of like, this is the style of the game, is we're just going along here. Even though I look at my notes, I'm taking some narrative risks here. Something else I do as a DM is on the improv stage is called side coaching. But at the table, it's, I don't know what you call it, guiding, asking leading questions. But I might say something like, so the thief and the fighter are talking to the prince. What's the cleric doing right now? And I look at the cleric and say, you say something that you weren't expecting to say. What is it that you say? So I give them this very narrow sort of window of, I just want you to fill in the blank. Or you find something in the room you weren't expecting. What is that? So I can direct them in a very specific direction instead of saying, what do you do? Which is, very broad. And of course they can improvise that, but it doesn't always feel successful, right? I do a thing that helps, but if you sort of set them up for success, like when you first meet your fellow adventurers, you tell him something you've never told anyone before.
I like that.
It just gives them a window of specificity, but also they can fill that with anything they want. Mm-hmm. And in terms of players, this is often just a different state of mind, because we're very often, and I know I was when I first started, is I'm in my little character silo. This is what I do. This is what I look like. This is how I'm interacting. But we want to broaden that. We want to broaden the idea of support here, which is, it's a kind of player empathy, character kindness, where I might go out of my way. If I know what my fellow adventurers is doing, I might drop my idea and say, I'm going to help you with that. Right? I'm going to put my idea in the back burner because your idea is super cool. On the improv stage, you're looking for opportunities to support as opposed to looking for things that I can do. So it's a different mindset. It's outward looking instead of inward looking.
Nice. I love that. That's really cool and a great way to think about it. I like the idea of prompting questions for two reasons. Certainly to help your players get in an improv mindset, but then also because it helps cut out on your prep. You find you see an interesting work of art. What is it? Means that you don't have to describe the work of art. And I've played a couple of games with the aforementioned lazy dungeon master Mike Shea. And that is one of the things he does. He's really into, for instance, describing enemy bad guys. When he's writing them down to keep track of hit points, he'll say, why is this bandit different from the other ones? Oh, well, she's wearing an eye patch, that kind of thing. Hey, we're going to take a quick break, and then it's back to more babble.
At the center of the great forest, on an island in the sky, the crow, deer, and wolf clans have been training 3 fearsome warriors from infancy for one purpose: to protect and serve the goddess of Estra.
So how exactly are we going to do that? Protecting the goddess, I mean.
Fran lies down.
Leica can't answer because she's too busy sniffing both your butts.
Okay, back off, Wolf Clan.
This disturbs me, but not to worry, I will instantly repress it.
These are the guardians of the goddess. Leica, the tiefling paladin who hails from the wolf clan.
Nobody's touching one beautiful hair on the goddess's head as long as I'm around.
Corbin, a human druid from the crow clan.
Human! I'm a crow!
And Fran, a water genasi wizard of the deer clan.
So, is there a way to quit this job or what?
This unlikely trio will venture forth into an unfamiliar world without knowing who can be trusted against the powerful dark force stalking the steps of their goddess and threatening the future of their world. Tune in every second Monday to Dames and Dragons, a 5th edition D&D actual play podcast. See ya then!
Michael, what about you? What's the give and take like at your table, and how do you support that and support people throwing out good ideas and that sort of thing?
Well, one of the things I want to circle back around to what Noel was talking about is playing with strangers versus playing with friends is, and this is something if you've listened to our show you've never heard before, session 0 is so important to set up, this is the type of game we're going to play. We're going to play a game where everybody can take narrative control, and we're going to improv, and we're going to make up stuff on the fly, and that's okay. Because for me, I didn't grow up playing that way. I grew up playing the DM's word was law, and I assumed everything that happened was a part of a plan. And as a player, I didn't think I had the authority to deviate from that. If I were to say, oh, there's a blacksmith shop over here, and on the DM's map there wasn't a blacksmith shop, I'm going to get told, no, there's not a blacksmith shop over there. You're wrong. And no is the enemy of improv. Yes and is the kind of the go-to. And whenever anyone talks about improv, they're like, yes and, even though most people have no idea how that actually would apply to a game table. And I probably don't either. Hopefully David will correct me later. but letting people know that it's okay to do that. And if you're playing in a convention, it's sort of the same thing. You don't have a session 0, but you have your expectations that you set at the beginning of the game, or maybe in the description that people read before they decide if they want to sign up at your table. And you say heavy improv game, so people know what they're getting into. And then with that, again, going back to the yes and, is if someone says something, it is now true. If you're giving them the ability to say something and it's true, then you have to go with it. You have to make it work. If you say no, that's going to just stop it dead in its tracks when they're thinking about doing it again later. Well, I said there was a blacksmith shop and they told me no. Why would I try to make up an NPC that I know or make up a detail about the weather? So I'm just not going to do that. So if you're saying you can do that, you have to run with it. And you don't want to negate other people's activities. If one of the other players says, hey, I'm going to go do this, don't say no. Don't, as the other player, don't be like, no, I don't want you to do that. I'm not going to let you do that. Very classic, I'm going to punch the king in the face. No, I'm going to stop you. And now you have interaction between players that has really nothing to do with the plot anymore. The guy punched the king in the face. Now what? How do you add to that? How do you change it? How do you correct it? But don't just negate another player's action. Never say always, never say never. Very rarely ever going to say that you negate someone else's action. Let them do what they want to do, and then you need to react to that. We did an episode on narrative control, which goes hand in hand with this. And what I always said is put a box on it. Like you were saying, like, what does that one person look like? I'm giving the player the freedom to create whatever they want, but it's within a very limited space. Like, they can't really destroy my secret plan if I tell them they can name one NPC, or they can give me one interesting detail about the village that they're walking into, or one rumor they've heard. That's not to destroy the plot, but it's like baby steps, and then maybe next time they can create something whole cloth, but I'm going to start with giving them a little bit of wiggle room. No matter what they say, I can go with it. And then sort of the last little, then I'll shut up. The little GM trick is you can always turn back to that's what you thought or that's what you heard. So if someone makes up something that just does not make sense, you can always when it comes back around and what they said was not correct, well, your character heard that the emperor was a vampire. Turns out they weren't.
Actually, Michael, I'm going to ask you not to shut up because I have a question for you that I know relates to an RPG Academy podcast you had recently, which is about the old yes and, right?
Yes.
So I think what you're saying is true, right? If you give the players an opening, you should generally accept what they say is true, unless, for instance, what is unique about this bad guy? Well, this bad guy is totally ineffective and vulnerable to all of my attacks, right?
Absolutely.
Or what do you find that's interesting in this room? 1,000 Vorpal swords. That kind of thing, totally okay to negate.
Yes.
There's a principle here that is sometimes wrapped up in yes and, which isn't quite accurate.
Yes.
Which is what you just said is true. Like, of course, there's not going to be 1,000 Vorpal swords, but there's a way to receive that information and not negate it, which is simply using the word and then add a different kind of information. So yes, you do see 1,000 Vorpal swords, and it's an illusion, and your character fell for it.
Ah, right. Or you see 1,000 Vorpal swords woven into the tapestry image on the wall before you, that kind of thing. I like
that.
Right. And they're sentient and they're attacking you.
Right.
That's exactly right. The principle is the same, but you can say, so but is just a polite way of saying no. Mm-hmm. So you might as well say and then find a way to make it work. I just wanted to throw that in there because sometimes new improvisers but that's not true. I don't want that.
Right. Sure.
But when I teach this improv, so one thing I do with DLM communications is I apply the rules of improv to the business world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I always say your client is always right, but if they ask you something that you don't have, of course they're wrong. You can say, that's a really good thing that you want, and I'll see what I can do about getting it, and that's something we're working on, as opposed to no, we don't have it. Right. So I just wanted to throw that in there, but that it's the habit of yes and even applies to exactly the times where it, quote, doesn't make sense.
So this is great because this is exactly what I wanted to ask all of you. And Dave, you've just answered it. So, Michael, this is along the lines of yes and, right? Which I think is a great idea, right? It builds this idea of really offering and accepting story ideas, right? Offering and accepting those sorts of building blocks of story and building a scene and a relationship between characters and that sort of thing. That's a great way, Dave. I never really even thought of it that way, of still accepting what they said, but making the idea work for the story so that it doesn't break the game part of it, right? And so, Michael, I wanted to ask you, too, about yes and, because I think you have sort of a similar interpretation at your own table, right? This basic rule of yes and, how do you use it at your table?
Well, again, for us, we generally play with the same people. We're all on board. For the most part, we're doing an entertainment podcast where, when bad things happen, that's entertaining, and that's what we're going for. Winning for us is making the audience enjoy the story, not defeating the bad guy as efficiently as possible.
Right.
So when you're yes-anding and someone comes up with something that doesn't quite make sense, does it not make sense because we want to win, or does it not make sense because it violates some rule of the world that has already been established? If that were to happen, we would have to do some chicanery. It could just be editing and no one ever hears that. Or it could be what David was saying, is where we twist it a little bit. So, yes, you're right. You do now have the power to summon dragons, but then you wake up because you were in a drunken stupor. So I don't know if I'm answering your question directly or not, but the idea is that we're all on board. We all know what the goal is. The goal is to provide an entertaining experience for people listening. So we're all going to throw out things that we think does that. In an episode fairly recently of Wrought Iron, which is our current actual play that's very improv heavy, my character attacked one of the other players because I was drunk and I didn't understand what was happening. From a we want to win this battle standpoint, that was absolutely the worst possible thing that I could have done, because I, one, wasted my attack, and two, I attacked someone on our same team. But it made exact sense for the moment. It made exact sense for the story. And it didn't really hurt anything. Like, that character didn't die. We still won the battle. So we didn't say, no, that didn't happen, and then just keep the story moving, because that's going to kill the story dead in its tracks. And we also, as players, didn't all turn on my character and just, berate me for doing that, because it made sense in the story. We just kept going forward. We yes-anded it from a big picture where we're like, okay, that happened, and now what happened next? So again, I don't know if I'm doing a good job answering that question, but I want to circle back around one quick thing. For a lot of newer GMs that I've talked to, that when you try to explain yes and, they have a bad interpretation. They think that means you can never say no to a character. And I don't think that's accurate at all. But for me, most of my no's come before the game starts. Like, again, session 0. Can I start as a 15th level dragon rider? No, you cannot. Can I start with a magic item? No, not. You said there's no elves in your world. Can I play an elf? No, you cannot. That is totally fine in a session 0, because you're laying those tracks and the groundwork for the game. But once you're in the story and someone says, oh yeah, I know a guy, he's an elf. Well, I've already established that there are no elves in this world. So maybe this person is pretending to be an elf. Maybe this person has convinced the other player that they are an elf. But that doesn't mean they actually have to be an elf if that violates the rules in the world. But it is absolutely accurate that your character thinks they're, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it makes sense, parameters sometimes can be good for creating creativity. So having those parameters in your session 0, somebody really wants to play an elf, but, there are no elves in this world. Okay, maybe I'm a human who, cuts her ears in a specific way to look like an elf, and, is avenging the elf people who were killed off in this world, or that kind of thing. That is a crazy story. That's a character I want to play. That's my idea. None of you steal it. So I think sometimes with those parameters, you can do that, and you see that a lot of times in improv games, right? That there will sometimes be a hard and fast rule, even if that rule is as simple as when someone swipes the scene by running in front of it, the scene then changes. That's totally fine, right? Like, that's a hard and fast rule of that improv game. Like, a lot of long form improv does that. Then that's okay. So it is cool to see that. Noel,
Yes.
Actually, if you don't mind, James, I wanted to ask Noel a question.
Oh, go for it.
As someone else who plays in an improv sort of heavy game, What I have found in our game is that we tend, and with all improv games that I've been a part of, it tends to go more towards silly, because I think silly is easier to accomplish when you're improvising, because you can
Right.
just make up something crazy and now it's true.
Uh-huh.
How do you guys try to keep your story from just going wacky crazy when you're allowed to make up anything you want?
Well, I will say we don't generally very much, except for in our own backstories, make up that much of the story. It is like if we are making things up, it's very much like you guys were saying, it's a limited thing. It's what do you see here? Or what are you thinking? Or who did you know, back in the day? What memory did you have? So we do silly things all the time, or we attempt to. And kind of my answer to this question would be, too, that one of the things that we hear from our DM more than anything, our wonderful DM Cat, is not yes and, but you can try.
Yes.
Go ahead and try it. I mean, and I think that's one of the biggest differences between improv and like RPG games in general, is there is that limit. It's not necessarily, in improv you can kind of just say whatever. You can say, and then I jumped 10 feet high in the air, and now you have to deal with why I could do that. Whereas in D&D, you can say, well, roll a dice to see if you can jump 10 feet in the air, and you can't, basically, because the check is going to be real high.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, right? Because there is this big difference in RPGs in that we are limited by mechanics and by the results of often die rolls or drawing a card or that kind of thing, which is where the you can try comes in, right? Which is super fun, a super fun thing to say to your players. What's a good way to then interpret those dice rolls? And like, can a 1 be just as exciting and fun for a player to narrate as a roll of a 20? What do you think, Noel? Like, do you have as much fun describing your character failing as you do that character succeeding?
Right. Oh, way more fun. It's
That a girl.
Yeah. I mean, on Dames and Dragons especially, all of our characters are kind of hapless teens too. So whenever we fail at almost anything, there's a good reason for it, and it's really funny. And I would say that our DM has a lot of fun describing those things as well. Actually, recently we had a sequence that I actually think didn't make it into the episode, but where a character was going to do something, and she literally said as she was rolling, I can't wait to fail at this. And then she succeeded, and she went, oh. Because a lot of times that is more fun, especially when it's something that, isn't so imperative for the story. You're not going to have fun necessarily in that moment when you're failing a check where you're about to be seen by your biggest enemy and you're not going to stealth your way out of it. But I think even in that situation, like you were saying, that makes the game more interesting. So even if it's getting you into this tight spot that you don't know how you're going to get out of, especially for making a podcast and not just playing, you can really look on the bright side of that and say, like, this is a much more interesting situation. Like, this has that feel of like the last act of a movie, everything's going wrong. And how are we going to bring ourselves out of it? Because it's going to be a much more triumphant moment for the fact that this happened.
Totally agree. And it's, you're right. I think sometimes when we first start playing the game, we approach it as a game rather than as a shared storytelling exercise, right? And so we have that mentality that sometimes goes as far as, GM versus players. But still, even people who lose that, you might still hold on to a little bit this wanting to succeed at everything, which is natural. You're the main characters. So in a story, you want to see the main characters succeed. But man, Game of Thrones would be real boring if Ned Stark was like, I solved everything in the first episode. And then it was just us watching people eat feasts for the rest of the 7 seasons, right?
So there's a pretty common saying about failing forward.
Yeah.
I have an initiative I'm trying to press that we're going to change that to calling failing funward. because failure can be the most entertaining part of any game. When you don't do what you thought you were going to do, that's when the fun happens. Now, it's different, kind of what Noel was saying, is like, hopefully no one dies from that. If I, as Army, do something stupid and I got another player character killed, I would probably feel awful, and I would probably stop doing some of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But if I can do something dumb and everyone at the table laughs, hopefully anyone listening to our show laughs, but there's not a lot of consequences as far as life or death, then it's okay, and people are okay with that. And it's even okay if we make the story worse and we're now in a worse situation. But again, if I push someone off a cliff and their character dies because of the fall, that's not good entertainment. But if I can push someone off the cliff and they have to catch onto a rock that's 20 feet below, and now we have to save them while the bandits are chasing us, that's fun.
For sure.
And it's a shift in your mindset to have fun with failure and let that be fun, and also let dramatic moments come out of that, right? Like you said, doing something stupid, I think, certainly makes sense, but also there are times in stories, heroes they try with all of their might and fail, right? They fail to catch their friend as they slip over the side of a cliff. They fail to, and that is a character death, but that is meaningful for the person who failed to save that person then. And so an interesting story can come out of that. What do you think, David, about failure and interpreting failure at the table? How do we do that and make it fun and interesting? Just as fun as rolling a critical hit.
Michael, I'm gonna steal your failing fun word phrase.
Sweet.
I'm gonna take it and make it my own, and I might give you credit, maybe I won't. I don't know. But I thought that's just a really, really great way to think about that. So, James, you just said that there's a different mindset in here. In improv, we say there's no such thing as failure. It's only a failure if you call it out, right? If we establish a reality and someone, quote, makes a mistake and somebody says, hey, you broke the rules, then that's calling someone out and that's a failure. But you can establish a reality, somebody, quote, breaks the rules, and then you can say, now that's the new reality. It includes this thing that wasn't there before. Mm-hmm. So we've expanded that reality. So if you buy into that idea that there is no such thing as failure, then right now in these examples we're using, it's not failure, it's forwarding the story. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's no need to put any kind of negative connotation on it. If you roll a critical fail and you fall and hit your head, and you remember something you had forgotten before, right? It's like, it doesn't matter. It's just another thing that's happening. We're the ones who are placing a value on it, but there's no objective reality about whether it's positive or negative, not because we're telling this story. If the goal is we're all doing something together, moving forward, the story is the thing that's moving forward. Even if one of the character dies, that's still an element in front of the previous element. So yeah, sort of changing that mindset of, oh man, I failed, to, wow, that's a new piece of information. Great. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that moving forward collectively?
It's great to enjoy failing. It's great to revel in that, because then you have fun no matter how the game goes, right? The game aspect still matters because it's creating these moments, but you can't have a bad game, right? If failure is okay and everybody is on board with that. And so I think one way to get comfortable with that is to play some games that encourage failure. Fiasco is a storytelling game that comes to mind, where the whole point is to tell a story where everything goes wrong. That's one really fun way to do it. Telling horror games, horror role-playing games, have the expectation that people are going to die. That sort of thing, I think, can help people shift their mindset and see how fun failure can really be. We are running a little short on time here, so before we go, I've got one final question for all of you, which is, what are some of your favorite game systems to improv with? What are some good sort of role-playing games that people can check out that can help build their improv skill set? Or if not role-playing games, what are some books or exercises or, whatever people can check out to sort of help them get comfortable with the idea of letting go of the books and the rules and the character sheet a little bit and just telling a story? And why don't we start with you, Michael?
So for me, the two games that come to mind, top of mind, I should say, are Wushu. And David, if you have not played Wushu, you definitely should. Actually, everyone should play Wushu. It is an amazing rules-light game where you determine exactly what happens. So there is no, I want to hit the goblin with the sword. It is, I hit the goblin with my sword and his head comes off. That is true. What I have said is reality. The dice just determine how far along I have gotten to completing that scene. So the scene may need 8 successes, and I only get 2 successes on cutting that goblin's head off. So there's still something out there the DM has to figure out, okay, why didn't that solve the scene? And then you have to create some new element that, okay, well, that goblin was actually being possessed, and now you freed the spirit, and now you're fighting a demon, or whatever the case may be. The other one would be Dread. If you're not familiar, Dread is also a rules-light game. It uses a Jenga tower. It's traditionally used to tell horror stories, but you can tell any type of story with it you want. And there is no character sheet. It's simply, I want to do a thing, and the DM determines how many bricks you have to pull. And if you pull that many bricks, the thing that you said happens. So if you want to try to jump over a pit to get away from the werewolf, you pull 2 bricks, you jump the pit. That happened. There is no maybe yes, no type of thing. So there's a lot of improv and sort of just making things up as you go. And then just a very quick plug. If you go to our website, and there's a game we called it's the Trial of Wushu. So it's the first time I ever played it. The DM did an amazing job of just going with some of the crazy stuff. I would say it's like a master class in how to run improv at a D&D or a role-play game table.
What about you, Noel? Like any games or improv exercises, whatever people should check out to help them become better improvisers?
Frankly, I'm not like super experienced with a lot of different RPGs. One thing that we've actually done in our friend group with the ladies on the podcast and other people as well is we actually just change the rules of games we know as we like.
Nice.
One campaign we're playing right now is sort of based in D&D rules, but it's actually an Oregon Trail campaign. So we just forded a river, but like we're a bunch of like, dwarves and whatnot. And I think we're all dads too, which isn't, I don't know. Anyway, that's, it's a fun game. So I think no matter what game you're playing, you can make it very improv heavy if you want. And especially if your DM is willing to do that. One game, and I can't remember the name of it. It's not like an RPG game. It's just like a party game. It's called something like The Story in the Tavern or something. And it's something we play a lot. And it's basically you start telling a story and everyone else in the group keeps asking you questions. Like you're like, I was going into this. I think this is probably just like an improv game, but I went into the temple and I found, the great God. And it's like, what? Your wife? Like, and then you have to say, yes, my wife, who is the God of the temple. I finally found her after 50 years. And, and they keep asking questions like, but what did you do? Like, I thought she died. And then etc. The idea is that you're lying and you just start going along with everybody at the bar and what they're telling you. But it's a really fun game and it goes in really interesting directions. So if you're interested in improving, I would recommend it.
Nice. That sounds awesome. I have not heard of that, so I do want to check it out. I love that.
Yeah.
And I agree. Hacks are a really fun thing to do, right? To take a system like D&D and apply it to the Oregon Trail or, to cave person times or whatever.
Right.
Be fun as well. And it's a great way to sort of stretch your mind then because you think about, okay, this is how this mechanic works, but how do I interpret it for this kind of story, right?
Right.
Which is great. What about you, David? Any games or techniques or anything that come to mind to help people build up their improv skill?
Well, Noel, that's a really, really cool game. I actually slipped my memory, but I agreed. And there's one similar to that, which isn't quite so dynamic, but is a really good diagnostic for how giving you are, storytelling, which is you just go around the circle and you tell a story a couple lines at a time. So if there was the four of us here, I might say, once upon a time there was a dragon in the forest, and then Noel would pick it up, and the dragon ran into the cave and hid on its pile of gold. And then if Michael says, but the gold is actually lava, right? So that tells us Michael isn't the most giving, thoughtful player. It's usually not that obvious, but it's a really interesting diagnostic if you want to just sort of see how your players work together. Some people's habits are to say no or to throw in something just for a joke, as opposed to moving the scene forward. So that's just it's just a really simple exercise to just sort of play with that idea. If you want a nice snapshot of contemporary improv, so this is like stage improv, it's called the Upright Citizens Brigade Comedy Improv Manual. And Upright Citizens Brigade, their style of improv it's very specific and constricted, but they do lay down some really, really good rules. So I think the first chapter of that would give people just a really good basic understanding of what some nice improv guidelines are. And lastly, I haven't played this in a long time. I think the RPG I'm thinking of is Feng Shui. It's an action movie role-playing game.
Yes.
You familiar with this?
Yeah, I've played it a couple times. It's definitely very improv, player narrative control heavy.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, if you walk into a room, the players get to decide exactly what is in that room. And is that correct, Michael? Am I remembering that right?
I've only played it a couple times, but I do remember being asked a lot, like, how many bad guys are they, or where are they at, that type of thing. So it may be that I just don't know it from the GM side, but that sounds right.
Yeah, I think that's I'm remembering that correctly. But yeah, I was like, wow, there's the DM's just asking us stuff, and we're just inventing the story as we go along. So I'd recommend taking a look at that.
Another quick plug: we do a show on Wednesday nights called Detention, and we do actually 2 improv games as part of that show. One is called 10 Things, which is just a very quick, sort of immediate. I give you a prompt, name me 10 things that you would find in a goblin's backpack. And you just try to come up with 10 things as quickly as you can. And good answers are not as important as fast answers. Sure. So we do that during detention. We started doing that before every game. So like when we're getting ready to play Wrought Iron, we will do the same thing just to try to get everybody kind of in that mindset. And then we do another game, which I hate, but everyone who watches loves, which is Wherever My Fingers Spin. And that's where I give you a prompt. And you have to come up with a scene using your fingers, and you talk, hello, how are you doing? I'm doing great. How are you? And your 2 fingers have to have a conversation, and you have a beginning, middle, and ending scene. Again, it can be anything, like you're in Walmart or you're in the Shire for Bilbo's birthday. It's just whatever comes to mind. And both of those help you just on the spot have to make up a small story. I am terrible at it, but people like to see me fail. But if you're good at it, it probably would be helpful.
Nice.
That's fun. Those are awesome games and tricks and exercises for people to do. I love that. Another game I'll throw out there is so the new Fantasy Flight Star Wars system, which I guess is not so new these days, has these great mechanics for you roll dice, and then the way you have these dice that all have different symbols that mean different things, and then it's up to the person who rolled those dice to sort of interpret what success with 2 advantages, or what failure with a triumph, or what, succeeding but getting a despair looks like. And so that's really fun, and they have announced that they are going to use that same system as a generic system. So they're going to put out a book that will help you tell any story you want using that mechanic, that I think is going to be really interesting and powerful. So definitely the Fantasy Flight Star Wars system is going to be fascinating to see translated into other genres. So I'm excited for that. Well, I think that is going to do it for this episode of Tabletop Babble. But before we go, where can people find you, Michael?
I'm most often found on Twitter at The RPG Academy, and pretty much any social media. If you search The RPG Academy, it's probably me. Of course, our website, which is also therpgacademy.com. Our podcast is that. We do a lot of stuff, including some Twitch shows, a lot of podcasts. We even run our own convention. So if you're in Dayton, Ohio in November, you can come by and play games with us. But Twitter is the easiest.
Yes. Yeah. If you're in Dayton, Ohio in November, come by and play games with me, too, because I will also be at that convention. Noel, where can people find you?
You can find me anywhere you can find Dames and Dragons. So on Twitter, we're Dragon Dames. On Tumblr, Facebook, Dames and Dragons. Patreon, iTunes, Google Play, any of those things. Come by. We'd love to talk to you, even if you're not currently listening to our show, or especially if you're not caught up yet.
Excellent. And where can people find you, Dave?
You can find me at davidlewismarino.com. That's my website. It talks about my business, which is DLM Communications. And you can tell from that I apply the principles of improv and other theater techniques to interpersonal communication. So public speaking, customer service, team building, office communications, things like that. And I work for a for-profit and nonprofit. And if you have any question at all about how improv might affect your business or D&D life, just shoot me an email there. Just go to the contact section and I'd be happy to talk.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for joining me today on Tabletop Babble.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you. It was very nice to meet you, David and Noel, as well.
Yeah, likewise.
Nice to meet you guys.
I love talking about improv in D&D. It is one of my favorite things to do because it means less prep for me as a dungeon master. You know, Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and we could use your help growing our audience. Hop onto iTunes, give us a 5-star review. If you do, I will read your review out loud here on the show. You can make me say anything you want. It's pretty awesome because I'll read it verbatim if it's 5 stars. Right now, I am going to read Amir Mike. I'm going to read your review entitled Great Podcast. This podcast is so great, I told my mom all about it. She said, "Sweetheart, don't you know that Dungeons and Dragons will turn you into a cellar-dwelling devil worshiper? That James seems like a nice boy, but I'm sure he just wants all his listeners to join his evil cult. Too long, didn't read. Ignore my mom. This show is awesome." Well, thanks, Amir Mike. Thank you so much for this review. Really appreciate it. People, make me say anything you want. I'll quote your mom. I'll do whatever it is that needs to be done to get your review. #shameless. You know, people, Tabletop Babble is a show that is part of a great network, the Don't Split the Podcast Network. You should check out some of the other great shows we have here on the network. Right now, I'd like to recommend to you the one and only Game O'Clock. Tired of hearing people shout into microphones about tabletop games? Why not hear people talk softly into microphones about video games? That's right. Our beloved Rudy Basso, co-founder, and his brother Alex Basso talk about video games every week over at Game O'Clock. Definitely check that out. They dive deep into one specific genre, talking about histories, favorites, least favorites, and the future of that genre. It's really awesome. I really, really enjoy it, and I'm constantly finding new great games to play thanks to Rudy and Alex. So check that out. All right, people, you can find me on Twitter at James Introcaso, and you can find me on my blog at worldbuilderblog.me. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network, thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Remember, RPGs are like sex. The more people who are doing it, the more fun you'll have.
Gather round, travelers, to hear our tale.
A mysterious organization called the Sisters of Sorrow have swept up our 3 heroes, and it is up to Kara, Saye, and Arnadel to do battle with the forces of evil and financial destitution.
We shall battle with ancient lore.
Take them down with our sharp reflexes.
Hey, did you guys finish the last of the ale?
Venture Maidens is a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition actual play podcast featuring a cast of 4 lifelong gamers.
Kara, not now. We're recording a podcast ad.
Right. Chop it with my axe.
For gold and glory.
We post our episodes every other Sunday. We've got monsters, treasure, role-playing, a cool plot, and some strange NPCs. Find the Venture Maidens podcast today on iTunes or wherever podcasts are free. Until then, venture away.